So in the previous video, we touched the surface on what a fresh versus a stale query is. Let's go a little deeper. So there's fresh data that gets fetched and stored in the cache. This data after a point becomes stale, meaning it's essentially outdated. So when you create a query, you can pass in a parameter called Staletime that takes in a time value in milliseconds. So if I go inside my query here, I have an option to pass in a Staletime property. And I can pass in, let's say, 1000 or 10,000 milliseconds, which is essentially 10 seconds. This Staletime decides whether it's necessary to fetch the data again or whether the data that's sitting in the cache can be reused. Now, before actually showing how the Staletime works, I'll go through one more property called Refetch on window focus. So as the name suggests, if the window is out of focus, like for instance, you are out of the browser on a different app like Spotify, or even a different tab for that matter, once you get back to this application window, it will automatically make a refetch. So it will automatically trigger a fetch API call. So now I have 5 post requests. Actually, let me just clear this. I don't have any requests in my network tab right now. If I just go to this tab and then I come back to my application, it's going to make a new call. So this is not something that I have done. I have not written any logic to handle this. React query does this on its own. So this property, refetch on window focus, is true by default. I can pass it inside my query options object. I can actually pass it here and let's say have a different value, but by default it is set to true. That means anytime I switch between windows, by default it is going to make a refetch. Now let's come back to Staletime. I have passed in 10,000, which means that the data is going to stay fresh for 10 seconds. So initially when I load the application for the first time, it is going to fetch all the posts. Now, if I try to switch to a different tab and come back to my application tab, you'll see that it does not make any other API calls. Only after 10 seconds, if I switch between tabs, it will make the call. So let me show you this. I have a new post request. I'll actually clear this and reload the application, and within 10 seconds, try to switch between JSON placeholder tab and my application tab. Ideally, refetch on window focus should make the call right away, but it won't. Let me reload this. I have one call here. I switch between tabs and you see that there's no new call here. I do it again and still there are no new calls. But now, as you can see here, the post query has gone stale. It was fresh for 10 seconds, but now it has gone stale. This means that React query considers data from this query as stale. It thinks that this data is outdated. So now anytime I interact with this application, it's going to make one more fetch call. So if I go to this tab now and come back, you see that we have a new call and the data is fresh. It will stay fresh for 10 seconds and again it will go stale after 10 seconds. Yeah, it has become stale now. So again, switching between tabs is going to make a request. So basically the idea here is that it's okay if the data is not always fresh. We tell React query that the data can be considered fresh for 10 seconds. After that, it will go stale. So till 10 seconds, use the data that you have stored in the cache. Once the 10-second window is up, the data will go stale and you can update the cache with the new data by making a fetch API call. This again comes down to the fact that not every piece of data needs to be up to date. So based on your application's use case, this Staletime must be configured for individual queries. Now, similar to refetch on window focus, there's also a refetch on mount and refetch on reconnect. Again, the name gives it away. If the component unmounts for some reason, like say when you move to a new page and come back, or if there's a component that you conditionally render or remove from the render tree, once it remounts into the app, there will be a fetch again. So to show you this, I'll quickly add buttons to route between the pages. I'll import the link component from React Router DOM and use this link to route between with query and without query pages. So I have the button here. It's essentially a link that's going to go to the without query page, and similarly inside the without query page, I have a button with the same styles, but it's going to come to the with query page. So now if I go back to the application, I'll clear the network tab and I'll hit this button. Link is not defined. I need to import link inside without query. Yeah, this works. So if I go to the with query page, it does make a call. The data is fresh. I go back and I come back to the page. You see that there's no new request. I'll clear this and show you this once again. The data is stale right now. I'll go to the without query page. There's no query inside the without query page. So you see that we have an inactive query, which means that we have a query somewhere in the application and it's not being used by any component that we have in the viewport right now. So we have an inactive query. Now I'll go to the with query page. It makes a request. I go back to the without query page. If I come back, the data is still fresh, which means that we are still going to use the same cache data. Now it's gone stale. If I go back and come back, you'll see a new request. If I go back and come back, you don't see any new requests. So this was Refetch on mount. Refetch on reconnect deals with inconsistent network. So if for some reason the network goes down and then comes back, there will be a refetch for that again. So here, if I clear my network tab and I set my network to offline, then I set it back to no throttling, which is basically online, you'll see a new request. So all these refetch strategies that's happening in the background, we did not write any piece of logic for it. Everything is being handled by React query and you have an option to configure it based on your needs. All these properties have a default value, which is why you see that I have not passed in any property here, but it's still working. Whatever property that I'm introducing right now, so refetch on window focus, refetch on mount, or refetch on reconnect, all these three properties work out of the box, which means that there are default values for all these properties. You can set or unset these values based on your needs. The stale time that we see here also has a default value. So if I do not pass in the stale time property to this query, it's going to set it to 0 by default. So this essentially means that as soon as you make a request and fetch something, it will consider the data to be stale right away. So there's no caching happening and will refetch data all the time by default. This is where your application logic comes into play and you get to decide which piece of data should be cached and that too for how long. So this was a brief intro on caching using React query. You will see a lot of caching strategies and other data validation, data background sync methods in the coming videos. So yeah, do subscribe for that and I'll see you in the next one.